0 to 60 can define a performance car, but it's the fastest 60 to 0 that's the aim of Tarok's brakes. From road cars to race cars, circuits, special stages, or the autostrada, nothing reduces speed like Tarok's brakes. Italy gave the world the art of Da Vinci and Michelangelo. Tarok's has given drivers the art of stopping. For more information and to acquire your own masterpiece, visit tarox.co.uk. It's me, Mike Stone, and this is the Backseat Driver Podcast. I'd like to introduce to the show Ray Saltinstall, who is the author of Niki Lauda, His Competition History.
Hello, Mark. It's a delight to talk to you.
Now, this is your first book, and 9 years in the making, as you told me a little earlier. What tempted you to write the competition history of Niki Lauda?
Well, I suppose, why Lauda in the first place? Because he was my childhood hero. So he was sort of, for as far back as I can remember, he was at the front of my consciousness as a sporting hero. Why write a book about him? I set out to write the book that I wanted to read because it didn't exist, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
A lot of the material that I'd gathered together had partly, certainly a lot of the photographs had been amassed because I'd been building little 1/43 models of all the cars that he competed in.
So just putting in, I mean, there is the photograph of you with this vast array of small racing cars that are all representative of all the cars Lauda raced. I mean, just very quickly, how many model cars have you?
About 170.
All right, I'll tell my better half. She complains about my model cars, but they're nowhere near that numerous.
Right, okay, well, yeah, so you've got some way to go maybe with those, but yeah, largely, well, mostly scratch-built, and those that aren't will probably modified and correctly decaled and the rest of it. But having been through the process, which had been going on for a number of years of getting to that, I'd amassed quite a large photo archive.
Yeah.
And it occurred to me that there was a book in there somewhere. The original sort of theme came from, do you remember the Sterling Moss My Cars, My Career book that Doug and I did a few years back with Sterling Moss?
Yeah.
Well, why not approach this from a race-by-race basis? And let's see if we can actually do something where we say, here is every car that he raced, and here's the story of how each race went. Now, that presents some interesting challenges insofar as... it's quite easy to find out what happened and indeed to find a photograph of the 1975 Monaco Grand Prix. But if you want to try and find out a photo of the 1968 Tauplitz hill climb and what happened to a young driver who nobody had ever heard of, that's a little bit more difficult, hence 9 years, really.
Yeah.
So, you're trying to get back to original source material from reports that were produced the week after the race in either the local newspaper or the local sporting journal or the local version of whatever magazine is representative of something like Autosport or Motoring News in deepest Austria. Or you've got to try and get hold of the original steward's report for, sort of entry numbers and times and things like that. Some of it is... harder to find than others, but that's where the network of enthusiasts and historical researchers sort of comes into its own, because it's surprising how sharing and giving people are when you ask them for help.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is, it's like all racing drivers. You can only find information, shall we say, on a slightly more easy basis as soon as they become well known or famous. Until then, most racing drivers, no matter how good they became, their early career is, shall we say, it's a little bit shrouded in secrecy, because, as like you said, it'll only be the local paper or that country's equivalent of Motoring News that would have made any record of it.
Absolutely right, yeah. And well, there's an old saying, isn't there, that history's written by the winners. It's certainly written about the winners. So if you're, if your guy doesn't make a mark pretty quickly, he's trying to swim in murky waters to find the early stuff. I guess that's where I was slightly fortuitous with Niki, because he made an impact really from the get-go. Finished second in his first got reported in the local paper, much to the surprise of his parents, who didn't know he was there. And then won his next sort of 4 events. So within a very short space of time, there was a sort of coterie of local supporters who were following him around. He got a little sort of gang of followers who were taking quite an interest in him. So in magazines magazines probably the wrong thing, but things like Austro Motor and some of the broadsheets that were produced locally at the time, his name was starting to be mentioned really from the very beginning of his career. So as long as you collect those together and piece them together, it's a bit like a jigsaw, isn't it? You probably need half a dozen reports from any one race to get the full story of what happened.
Yeah.
And that was the process that we kind of go through. Even for the better known stuff, you can read a report of a Grand Prix in the 1970s, but you probably need half a dozen different reports to get the true picture of what happened, and indeed to get a correct perspective on it, because it's surprising how often errors are repeated.
Yes,
so,
it's called copying and plagiarism.
Absolutely right. What was interesting in all of that, actually, Mark, is that if you read Lauda's autobiographies, particularly For the Record and To Hell and Back, where in the back of the books he lists the races he competed in and how he got on, just purely from a resource perspective. There are 14 races in there that he doesn't mention.
Oh.
He doesn't even acknowledge that he took part in. One of those being actually his first ever single-seater race, which you would think would probably register, wouldn't you?
In most racing drivers' careers, the first single-seater race tends to be a bit of a high point in their career, doesn't it? It's something they want to talk about.
Absolutely right, because that's kind of what they've been aiming for. And particularly when it's one like his, because he'd been doing quite successfully in hill climbs, and he'd done a few airfield races. By this point, he was in a Porsche 911, and his uncle, who was a supporter of his, unlike his father, who wasn't. His uncle had been badgering Kurt Bergman, who was the boss of the Cayman Formula V team, a highly successful Formula V team in Europe at that time, and he was kind of the Colin Chapman of Formula V, was Kurt Master Bergman. So Uncle and young Lauda had been badgering him to give him a tryout, which Bergman had been swerving a little bit.
Yeah.
And finally, he relented and said, "Okay, you can have a drive, but here's the deal: the transporter driver is on holiday, so if you drive the racing car transporter to the next race with 3 cars on it and a trailer with the fourth, and bring it back in one piece, then you can drive the fourth car in the race." This was happy days for Niki, because as a kid, as a teen, he really used to like driving the Opel Blitz delivery lorries that ran from his dad's paper factory, that the guys, the delivery guys, used to let him drive.
Yeah.
So he was quite familiar with the vehicle. But the rub with this whole thing was that the first race was actually in Kemala in Finland.
Oh, right.
So he has to drive this thing from Vienna to Kemala. So it's a complete road trip, including crossing the Baltic, that takes however many days to get there. But he gets it there in one piece. The Caymans were the class of the field, comprehensively outclassed anything that the Scandinavians had shown up with. They finished 1, 2, 3, 4, and Niki was the fourth, and he brought the thing back in one piece all the way down the Autobahn. I think they'd just gone somewhere near Hamburg when the drawbar on the trailer broke.
Yeah.
And he managed to stop the thing in a straight line from 70 kilometres an hour or whatever. And they decided the only thing they could do, because the trailer was beyond the repair, there was no hard shoulder either, so they slung the trailer over the crash barrier, hitched the fourth car to the back of the transporter, and hauled it back to Vienna. So, it's a rattling good story, and yet he makes no mention of it in any of his own work, which in some ways endorses the fact that he had very little interest in his own history. He was unemotional about that completely.
And because, looking well, besides you're saying the Porsches and the Formula Vs, he raced cars that most people wouldn't have expected him to race. he had a bit of a spell in minis at one point, did he not?
He started out in mini. The first car that he had, because he'd already been through a couple of road cars before he got to his first race, some of which only lasted a matter of a few hundred yards, really. But he had a drive in the road mini that belonged to his friend Peter Draxler, and wrote it off against a stone bridge parapet on an icy road. Went and begged his grandmother to give him some money so that he could buy the wreck off Draxler's father, because he knew he was selling it, and he immediately part exchanged the wreck for the first racing mini, which was it had won the Austrian Hill Climb Championship the year before in the hands of a chap called Fritz Baumgartner. Lauda, right from the beginning, he was very keen on having the best prepared and the best available machinery at his disposal. He only raced the Mini 4 times. As I say, he came second with it first time and won the next 3 races with it. But it was always immaculately turned out. And he continued that with his next car, which was a Porsche 911 that he'd done a similar sort of part shop deal with Peter, who had also raced this thing quite successfully on the hills and on the airfields. And he had it prepared by Gerhard Mitter, who, as well as being the driver, had a reputation as a preparation specialist.
Yeah.
So I think, the Lauda name and the fact that there was some money in the background helped that, even though it was very hand-to-mouth existence. But going back to the point that you made, yes, he raced an absolutely eclectic range of machinery. People would think, Lauda, he's the guy who drove for Ferrari and McLaren, isn't he? But outside Formula One, where of course he also drove the March and the BRM, and Brabham, of course, he raced in touring cars. He raced BMW and Ford Capri touring cars, and he raced in all sorts of oddball things in one-offs. He did a Formula Pacific race in 1984 in a Ralt. He did a couple of little sort of oddball touring car races, a couple of charity races in Fiats. He did a Nissan Pulsar Challenge in Australia. Really sort of oddball things that you wouldn't have expected a Formula One driver to be doing even in the 1980s.
Yeah. So, I mean, when as time progressed, were you ever fortunate enough to meet him?
The closest I got to that was the 1982 British Grand Prix, where he was walking across behind the paddock, and I said, "Can I get your autograph, Niki?" And he sort of said, "Maybe later." It may not have been as polite as that, but that was very typical of the guy, I guess. Really, which it's a shame I didn't get the opportunity to talk to him first person, but in some ways that didn't necessarily damage the text, because the book is a factual account.
Yeah.
It's based on reportage rather than the stuff about his own life and his own life story, because he's done that so well himself, of course, in his autobiographies and his 2 How to Do It books, if you like. And there's a couple of good biographies about him. There's also a couple of very bad biographies about him, but it didn't necessarily mean too much damage to the text by not being able to have that conversation, shall we say.
Right. And did he know you were writing this book?
No. The manuscript was finished literally a couple of weeks before he died. I'd been putting it together for quite a long time. And when he died in May last year, I hadn't even got a publisher lined up for it. There were a few people who knew I was doing it. There were a few people on the Autosport Nostalgia Forum in particular knew I was doing it. And when he died, I was almost on the point of shelving it, because it felt a little bit macabre and ghoulish.
Yeah.
But a few people who knew I was doing it, one of them being Doug Nye, said, "Yeah, do it." In fact, Doug's specific words to me were, "Do it, but don't F it up."
Yeah.
Good advice, which hopefully I took to heart. And that's one of the reasons why Doug wrote the preface for it. But within sort of 4 or 5 days of him dying, I spoke to Mark Hughes, who's the editorial director at Ebro, and I said, "I've got this project. Are you interested in having a look at it?" And he said, Tell me about it. So I gave him the idea of the scope, roughly the size of it, and what was involved. And within a week, we'd signed a contract. And the whole process then, I mean, that conversation happened at the end of May, and we actually published the thing on the 1st of November. So it was an incredible turnaround in terms of editing, photo approvals, because none of the photos were licensed at that point.
I was going to say that can be one of the problems, because a lot of the images that you might have collected and managed to accrue and pull together, you would have had to have sought permission to publish. Did you find this a problem?
About 100 of them we were given, including some of the very earliest ones, like the photo of the Mini on his parents' drive the day before his very first race, which actually came from a chap who accompanied him on the trip to Kimola that we were talking about earlier. So about 100 of them were sort of given by private individuals who had collated them. Some came from more well-known archives. A lot of them came from private and lesser-known archives. But we specifically tried, or I'd certainly tried in the first instance, to use photos that were not the familiar ones and the ones that have been published a lot, but also ones that weren't just a close-cropped photo of a car, that had a little bit more background to them, that gave you an idea of the ambience of the place where he was racing and what conditions were like. And that's as you go through the book, that kind of tells a story in itself, as you look at how tracks evolved, how circumstances evolved, and safety facilities changed and developed throughout the course of his career.
Yeah.
Certainly when you look at some of the photos that were taken, say in Belgrade or Budapest or Sopron, in a few sort of Formula V races that he did behind the Iron Curtain, they're eye-opening, really. I've got some that we didn't use. I've got a cracking photo that was taken in Brno in 1970 in the Formula 3 race there. We didn't use it because he's running third in the photo, and it's a little bit grainy.
Yeah. But
it's just crazy, It's through the centre of one of the villages at Brno, and there's just there's no safety facilities whatsoever. It's like Spa would have been in the 1930s. There's just lampposts and trees and spectators hanging out of doorways, and no Armco in sight, and 6-inch curbs. It's crazy.
Well, not being funny, it's like the Targa Florio. I mean, that was people used to stand on the front doorsteps to watch them go past, didn't they?
Indeed. I'm laughing because whenever anybody mentions the Targa Florio, I'm always reminded of what Paul Hawkins said about that, because I can't remember who was co-driving with Hawkins at the time, but they expressed some reservations about how close the spectators were and that you might hit some of them. And Hawkins said, well, I'd rather hit spectators than a bridge parapet, because spectators are mushy.
I mean, unfortunately, I have driven the Targa Florio both for pleasure, and I was invited to, I mean, it's now a rally. A form of rally, so I was fortunate to have driven it on in the two variations. But once again, there's a particular rock face with the memorials in, and the memorials, it's a bit like underneath each little memorial there's an arrow, and that's where the poor benighted soul impacted.
Yeah, well, the thing about the Targa, I know we've got off piste a bit here, but it's interesting that one of the things about the Targa, of course, was that the spectators behaved a bit like some of the more lunatic ones do on rally stages, didn't they? I mean, was it 1973 when Jackie Hicks had famously made some comment about not liking the place, and he thought the best thing that could happen would be for Mount Etna to bury it.
Yeah.
He came hurtling round the corner, I think, on his first lap. I think it's in Colosano or something like that, and found a great big rock in the middle of the road. And the next thing, he's in the wall.
Yeah.
So they certainly made it a little bit more dangerous than it perhaps should have been.
And the other thing is, as I said, we're on a little bit off piece here. They used to have to drive round early in the morning on the of the race day, for the simple reason, since Sicily is so volcanic, to just check that there were no holes that appeared. And there's one particular corner. Anybody out there who's easily offended, you won't like this. It's called Paraplegic Corner, because there was a young paraplegic lad used to stand there and wave enthusiastically. They went round there one morning to discover, basically, a 4 foot deep, 2 feet wide trench had made its appearance over the course of the night because there'd been a bit of tectonic shifting going on.
Crikey, yeah. That might bring a temporary halt to proceedings, mightn't it?
I mean, the only thing they did was fill it in and hope that nothing else appeared, and off they went for the day. I mean, it was very laissez-faire was racing back then, was it not?
It was, and that point actually, that comes through when you certainly look at if you look, say, at the Formula 3 era that he was racing, and I mentioned then about the lunacy of Brenova, and of course Lauda famously got out of Formula 3 racing because he said it was inhabited by madmen, having had a couple of very crazy shunts in his last. Well, his first Formula 3 race lasted about 4 seconds because he got away off a fairly poor grid position, and his teammate Gerald Pankel's engine cut out right in front of him, and Lauda sort of tore the wheels off his car against it. And his very last Formula 3 race, about 2/3 of the way through that year, at Zolder, where he was in a pack of cars that sort of crested a brow to find an ambulance in the middle of the track on its way to another accident. So the cars are sort of darting left, right and centre to try and swerve around this thing. It must look like the wacky races. And although he missed the ambulance, somebody else hit him, spun him around, and somebody else T-boned him. So he's left there, sat in the middle of the track, basically in a chassis with no wheels, waiting for the impact that never arrived. There were no yellow flags at all, let alone wave one. So the next pack just came sort of hopped over the brow. One of the cars went straight over the nose of his, and everybody missed him. And when they got out of the way, he jumped out of the car, ran it, and jumped over the barrier and said, "That's it, that's me done. I'm not doing any more Formula 3." He promptly went off and then raced a Porsche 908 Spider in a bit of inter-serie and German sports car racing. Yeah. But that whole Formula 3 era of his was characterised by this sort of itinerant lifestyle that was so popular in junior Formula racing around the time, where you trailer the car from one race to the next and hope that you made enough start money and prize money at race A to get you to race B. Yeah. There's one of the photos earlier on in the book where it's taken the paddock at, I think it's at Magny-Cours, where, because him and Gerald Pankel had formed a little sort of Vienna racing team enterprise. They bought a couple of McNamaras, which was definitely not the car to have in 1970 in Formula 3. And they were racing these things around Europe, as I said, sort of in a hand-to-mouth way. So this photo is taken in the Magny-Cours paddock of Pankel leaning sort of nonchalantly against the back of the transporter, and Lauda's there pumping up the back tyre of his car with a full pump. It's a far cry from Scuderia Ferrari. Yeah, I mean,
like you were saying with the Formula One, he was renowned for Ferrari. Of course, it was the Ferrari had his huge accident in at the Nordschleife. And the famous phrase by Hunt, the only man who could come out of a fire more handsome than it was before he was in the fire. I mean, everybody thinks Hunt and Lauda were, they were rivals, but they were also great friends.
Well, that, of course, is the great central premise Hollywood treatment in Rush has added fuel to that fire, hasn't it? Because it presents them as guys who hated each other, whereas, as you say, they were best buddies and had been since 1970. They briefly raced against each other in Formula 3, but they were certainly racing against each other in Formula 2 crossover, and kind of arrived in Formula 1 around the same time. Yeah. And initially, Hunt was probably thought of as the better prospect. Yeah. He was going gangbusters with the Hesketh March in '73, whereas Niki was trying to drag the BRM around, which was certainly not the thing to have in 1973 either. Although it is, of course, what made him his reputation with Enzo by the Monaco Grand Prix, where he kept the thing in front of Ix's Ferrari for about 20 laps in third place. And also, perhaps less well known, the British Grand Prix in '73, when Scheckter took out half the field at the end of the first lap. At the restart, of course, Lauda had got a great big empty space in front of him on the grid. So he basically rocketed up the inside of the pit wall and was second or third into the first corner behind Peterson and Stewart, and was making quite a good fist of it until his tyres went off after about half a dozen laps.
Yeah.
But it was that had really got Enzo's attention as much as the Monaco race had, and it was only a matter of weeks after that he signed the contract with Ferrari.
Yeah. I mean, and then of course he took he took some time off for Lauda Air and everything else, and then I mean I was once told that the main reason he came back and drove McLaren was he was short of cash, and that was how he would get some money back in his bank.
It's a popular story. He always denied that that was the case. He went in 1981. He went along to the Austrian Grand Prix with an Austrian journalist called Heinz Prüller, who was doing some commentating, I think. And I've got a photograph of him sort of standing there watching proceedings, and there's this, you can see that in his face he's thinking, maybe I'm not finished with this yet.
Yeah.
Maybe I left too early. He certainly thought that relatively quickly after his departure in 1979, he'd obviously immersed himself in his airline, made it very successful. He was certainly battling bureaucracy with his airline in that. He was finding that tiresome, but he was never a guy to give up. So he was rattling away with that. But his comeback, I think, into Formula One was more to do with unfinished business than it was to do with needing the money. Even though he managed to screw a huge fee out of. I say out of McLaren, but it was actually out of John Hogan at Marlborough.
Yeah.
To be able to come back. He of course had got a relationship that he'd already built up with Ron Dennis from 1979, because in 1979, when he was having his final year with Brabham, which was the nadir of his career really in terms of results and performance, because the car was an absolute disaster. He'd concurrently raced in the BMW Pro Car Championship that supported 8 Grand Prix throughout the year.
Yeah.
You remember the big fire-breathing BMW M1s, and
Yeah.
the car that Lauda was driving in that had been built and prepared by Project 4, which was Ron Dennis's setup before he bought out McLaren. So they'd worked together before. They both had a similar work ethic. They both had a similar fastidiousness when it came to attention to detail. So it was a bit of a natural thing that when he decided to have a tryout in a Formula One car, it would be with McLaren.
Yeah.
Because he got offers on the table for Williams. Brabham wanted him back as well, of course. He came very close to signing for Williams, apparently. But he would say that was probably the one regret he had as a driver, was that he never drove for Williams, because he liked their sort of racer attitude and philosophy. But he was also very taken with the technicality of the carbon fibre MP4 McLaren. He was also very taken with the fact that obviously John Watson had a huge shunting one at Monza in 1981, where the car basically broken in half and back off and got up in flames, and Watty just got out and walked away from it. That obviously resonated with Niki after his previous experience.
Yeah.
And even at that early stage, the mood music was that they were going to have a turbo engine that was going to take some development, because the more complicated the better as far as Lauda was concerned with cars. He liked things that were really complex and difficult and needed a lot of sorting out and optimization. That was absolutely right up his street. So all of the challenges that were coming with McLaren were exactly what he wanted, and that's probably what finally inked it for him.
And I mean, one of the great things about your book is it was Watson who's written the foreword for you. I mean, how did that come about?
I discussed with with the publishers who would be the most appropriate person who we could approach for that. Because at this point, I'd already got what was originally going to be the foreword written by Kurt Bergman, the Kaiman boss, that we ultimately used as an after, because of the way it was phrased and the way it resonated, and it worked better in that environment. But given that John had been Niki's teammate for a couple of years at Brabham, for a year at Brabham, and then for a couple of years at McLaren, he seemed to me to be the best person we could ask to do the job if he was prepared to do it.
Yeah.
And by coincidence, he had either been an advisor or had written a contribution to another book that Evra had previously published, and my editor had his phone number, so we approached him and asked him if he'd be prepared to do it, and he said absolutely. So I interviewed him for a couple of hours. I think I probably only asked him 2 questions, and he just, because he's a cracking raconteur, he can just, he just makes it live.
Yeah.
So he just gave me a stream of consciousness, really, and which is pretty much exactly what the forward to the book is. And there was awful. It's a shame actually, because there's an awful lot of stuff that he told me that he said, "Oh, but you can't write that." But they clearly got up to. They clearly had a good time together, and they were clearly good friends. And that friendship and affection lasted right until the end of Niki's life.
Yeah. But, no, I mean, congratulations for writing the book. It's one of those things, until somebody tells you that it's been written, it's not a book you would, not being funny, it's not a book you would think of, but when you hear about it, you think, yeah, these are the sort of books that make for interesting racing. So I'll be perfectly honest, the modern racing driver, especially the modern Formula One driver, does absolutely nothing for me. They're decidedly personality-free, most of them. Whereas people like Lauda they're from the James Hunt era, etc., Graham Hill and everybody else. These guys were true personalities.
Indeed, and they spoke as they found, didn't they? And they were sort of blissfully free of PR watchers and political correctness as far as their teams were concerned.
Yeah.
So so they spoke as they found, which makes it more interesting. I think as well, the main thing is that they had this ability to race in different machinery, sometimes more than once on the same weekend. Not perhaps to the same extent as happened in the 60s, but certainly in a way that is just not possible now, because we've got such rigid exclusivity in a Formula One contract that, you can drive nothing else. Yeah. And everything has to be said in the, in the voice of the sponsor, and everybody's aware of the impact that it has on other people. There was a lot more freedom then, and I think that allows for some colour, as does the variety of the machinery and the variety of the places that they drove in. These days the circuits are very homogenous as well, aren't they? It's sometimes difficult to see where you are.
Well, I mean, in many respects,
an isolated photo.
In many respects, Spa's nothing like Spa used to be. Spa was dangerous, but I mean, technically, it was a little bit of the appeal of the sport. The other thing was, a lot of the cars all look different to each other, whereas now you could paint one car in all the different sponsors' livery, and nobody would be any the wiser that they were all virtually the same car. Back then, they were all individuals, as were the drivers.
Absolutely. I mean, somebody was talking about, if you like, a pub quiz game like that. If you painted all the current generation of cars white, how many of us would be able to tell which one was which? Yeah. And I know I'd struggle most definitely. Whereas, you do that for me with a 1975 grid, and absolutely no problem at all. I can tell you which one, which one every one of them is. And that adds to the appeal of it, I think, as well, doesn't it? That, particularly when you're looking at a book that's quite photo heavy. Yeah. That you've got a variety of attractive images in there, and you can try and spread that around a little bit.
But anyway, John, thank you so much for joining me on the Backseat Driver Radio Show. As you said, the book is by Evra Publishing. Can't I conclude, given our current climate, it's the perfect thing to enjoy your isolation with, and I conclude you can buy it online.
You can indeed, from the usual online sources, and of course direct from the publisher, which is nice and easy at EVRO, so evro.publishing.com.
And as I said, thank you very much for joining me on the show, John. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. It's a shame we can't chat a bit longer. It's one of these subjects we could probably have talked about. I could probably have included your interview of the next 3 shows, really. But regrettably, we only met very briefly at Race Retro because I was in the middle of interviewing somebody else at the time.
Absolutely, yeah. But always happy to repeat the process if necessary, Mark. I can talk about this for hours.
After 9 years of research, etc., I should imagine you will have. I conclude the rest of your family are now delighted it's been published because we'll get to see you again.
Yeah, although they're probably seeing a little bit too much of me with the current lockdown.
Take up tractor driving.
There is the answer.
John Saltinstall, thanks very much for joining me on Backseat Driver Radio Show. And as John's just said, the book, Niki Lauda, His Competition History, is available from Evro Publishing, EVRO Publishing. John, thanks very much indeed for joining me on the show.
Thank you very much for talking to me, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much. Rarely beaten on price, never beaten on service. Whether it's cars, bikes or commercials, Hodder Tyres are the best in the business. And when it comes to tyre expertise and advice to supplying the correct tyres for your vehicle's specific requirements, nobody comes close to David Lakin and the Hodder Tyres team. So give them a call on 01200 613 192 or visit the website at hoddertyres.co.uk.